Good day, World History. We are doing 4.4 today. This is a little bit shorter of a section, and so if you get done early, you could begin section 5, which is a lengthier section. Now, we have no class on Friday, so we'll end up doing test review on Monday. So you want to have the activity on the chapter review finished by then, and then we will plan on doing the test on Tuesday. So we are talking about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Just a reminder that we're talking about a 1,000-year period here largely, right? 500 BC, the rise of the Republic, and then the transformation of a republic into an empire. And now we're talking about up into the 5th century, so about 900 to 1,000-year period here. The reason for the decline, we're going to talk about several different issues that led to the crisis that faced the empire. The attempts at the end of the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 4th centuries at reform, the barbarian invasions. And by the way, that word barbarian, it comes from the word barbar. And that was just a way that the Romans had of identifying people who didn't speak their language. You know, it was like barking, bar. And so that's what this term refers to. It basically refers to people who weren't speaking Latin, and therefore they were considered outsiders. So, and then finally the fall of Rome. And we're focusing primarily on the collapse of the Western Empire that is going to transform into eventually something we would call Europe, and a revival eventually called the Holy Roman Empire, a more Christian version of the empire. Whereas the Eastern Empire is going to last for quite a bit longer, and we'll talk about that as we get into the Middle Ages. Why did the Roman Empire experience decline? What attempts were made to reform? What impact did the barbarian invasions have on the empire? And then what led to the fall? All right, so section 1 here in section 4, reason for decline. In the 3rd century, so again, we're talking about the period 200 to 300, a series of political, economic, and social crises shook the foundations of the empire. What happened in the 4th and 5th centuries that led to the eventual collapse? It says right there in the opening paragraph. What were the reasons for this decline and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire? Well, one important reason was Rome's political disorder. It has to do with the way the empire was run, but chiefly it had to do with the way the guy at the top, you know, we're facing a big election next week. We have a particular process that we go through in order to elect a president, a presider over our republic. What was the problem of succession in leadership? Well, the problem was, of course, that there was no mechanism for choosing a new successor. And so it was usually a violent end. I think we talked about at the end of the last section how, you know, there were almost 100 emperors during the 3rd century because there was so much violence going on, and killing and plotting. How was the army involved in all this process? Again, this is kind of an example of might makes right. The guys with the power make the decision rather than the people making the decision. It was the army, and as your book says, they were quite greedy. They wanted the guy who could give them the most rewards and the most benefit for their service in defense of this empire. Um, you could almost think of it as a huge um, mafia operation where you got the Don at the top, and then you got all of his henchmen, which is the army. Um, I think I mentioned to you how some people describe modern Russia with Putin as a thugocracy. It's just a huge state-run mafia, and that's kind of what was happening here. Closely associated with Rome's political troubles were its economic troubles. What were some of the factors that led to an economic decline? Well, it takes a lot to maintain this kind of an army, so there's increased taxation. There was devaluation of the currency in order to kind of spread the money out more, and that's never a good thing because it leads to terrible inflation. Moral decay was another factor. Now, right here, I want you to look at what were some of the virtues of the Roman Republic and the early empire. Now, these were not always specific, you wouldn't necessarily identify these as specifically Christian virtues, but there is some overlap. If you practice these things, you're often going to be very successful in life. The distinctively Christian virtues would be like faith, hope, and love. But even if you look at the fruit of the Spirit, you can see how some of these Roman virtues were kind of secular versions of what God himself produces in his people. So there were efforts at reform and reorganization as we come to the end of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire was at the point of collapse here. And again, we're talking about the end of the 200s, right? The 3rd century AD is the 200s. Which two emperors implemented effective reforms? They were Diocletian, who you remember was a great persecutor. He thought that the church was part of the reason why the empire was declining, and Constantine, who ends up becoming the great savior of the church. But he also was trying to implement reforms to maintain and preserve and restore the empire. In 284, Diocletian defeated other contenders and his army proclaimed him emperor of Rome, right? The army's involved here. So he sees the problem of how huge this empire, stretching all the way from Britannia down to North Africa, all the way over to, virtually the border of Persia. And so this is the administration of this empire, if it is going to be administered, is just getting to be too much. So he divides it into 4 called prefectures. And so he chooses another guy to be a co-emperor with him. And then they have 2 underlings called Caesars, who are kind of like vice presidents, although they had a lot more power than our vice president does. And eventually one of them is going to become the new emperor. Again, this problem of non-peaceful succession is going to lead, this solution is not going to last very long. Now, he introduced strong measures to combat Rome's economic problems. Name 2 of them. When he retired from office in 305, his system of joint rule fell apart. There's something about when you get that much power, you want more of it. You want to be the top dog. It's kind of endemic to human nature, that quest where the devil says, "You shall be as gods," and so that's what happened here again. The same problem of no stable succession appears. So Constantine eventually decides to make war against his rival. I want to say it was Maxentius, but I can't remember exactly the name. But he also saw that there were continued problems, and so he decides to continue these economic reforms. Which half of the empire did Constantine rule? You got a 50% chance of getting this right. He ruled the eastern half. Okay. Where was its capital? Well, it was a place called Byzantium, and so the Roman Empire that survives in the east, that is not destroyed by the barbarians, ends up becoming known as the Byzantine Empire. It was essentially the eastern form of the Roman Empire. And Byzantium, the capital, eventually comes to be known as Constantinople. Can anyone tell us what the name of that city is today? Istanbul. Istanbul. It was taken over by the Muslims eventually, by the Turkish Muslims. And it's not the capital of Turkey, that's Ankara, but it is probably the most important city in Turkey. Just like the capital of New Hampshire is not Manchester, even though Manchester is the largest and probably the most important city. It's Concord. The most important city in Maine is Portland, even though Augusta is the capital. All right, so Diocletian and Constantine prepared the way for the division of the Roman Empire into two empires. That eventually becomes the permanent fixture. Again, they just don't have enough power to maintain it as one entity. So the Pax Romana is gone, and eventually we're going to see a decline, especially in the western half. This division becomes permanent in 395 when Emperor Theodosius, by the way, that means given by God, a gift of God, like Theodore, divided the empire between his two sons. Which half fell shortly after this permanent division? That would be the western half. All right, barbarian invasions. And again, this word barbarian comes from barbar, just a way of describing people whose language you don't understand. So name some of these tribes. Well, the generic term is Germanic because they're coming from Northern Europe, but we've got Angles, we've got Saxons, we have Franks, we have the Lombards, and we have the Goths. Rome increased the size of its army in an effort to protect its borders from barbarian invaders. It seems like it's constantly having to do that. How did the emperors augment the size of their armies? Well, essentially, some of the tribes that they had good relationships with, they basically used them as a buffer, and even some of these guys became leaders in the army, and that's why eventually you end up having some emperors that aren't even Roman anymore. And that's part of the reason why when you get to the end of the section here, some people say, well, maybe it's not really that Rome collapsed, but that Rome transformed into this more, northern European, and it could be both and both that it collapsed. And you think of that whole process of death and resurrection that we see in Scripture, that things die, but then sometimes they come back in a new form, and so they're not completely gone. Out of the Far East in the late 4th century, so again, late 300s, came a new threat to Rome's security, the Huns. So they are all the way out, in Genghis Khan territory. and they've decided to come to the west. And who's their most famous leader, right? Attila, although they would pronounce it Attila. I actually have a friend who's a pastor in Hungary named Attila, named after this guy. Um, and so he's Attila the Hun. So the Germanic tribes were being driven uh, back by these Huns, and they were afraid, and so they thought that they could get help by settling amongst the Romans. One such tribe was the Visigoths, who crossed the Danube and settled in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Um, the Danube is a very important geographical, it basically served as the northern border in the east of the Roman Empire because it is so vast and there weren't many bridges back then. So it was a good natural border, just like a mountain range would be. If you remember the Alps, nobody thought Hannibal could cross the Alps. It was a great natural border for northern Italy. Anyway, Visigoth, just so you know, Vici is Latin for west, and so these guys are going to move over to another place, and they're eventually named the Western Goths. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Visigoths soundly defeated the Roman army and killed the emperor. And this, just was kind of a sign of the end of the Roman Empire, that they could be so soundly defeated by these barbarians. And so it was kind of the death knell, even though Rome doesn't formally collapse for another generation. This is a portent. So here you've got a map. Ostrogoths, by the way, Ostra means eastern. So they both kind of come from this Russian area. But as you can see, the Visigoths end up moving further to the west. And then these Germanic tribes coming out of Germany. And the Angles and the Saxons, by the way, what word do we get from Angle? We get England. So they were the Britons when the Romans were there. And basically, the Britons were what we would today call the Welsh. The Anglo-Saxons drive the Britons over to the western shore. And so, or you could also call them the Celts, and they become the Welsh. The Franks move in and take over the Gauls. And there you can see, not far from Byzantium, Constantinople, Adrianople. Nople is, or opal is a form of polis, okay, Greek word for city. So Indianapolis, Indian city. Adrianople, Constantinople. The fall of Rome. In 410, under the leadership of Alaric, the Visigoths moved southwestward into the Italian peninsula and plundered the city of Rome. And one of the things your book doesn't talk about is it's interesting how some of the bishops become involved in negotiating with the barbarians. And so it's less and less the emperors that are involved, and it's men of the church who actually, and they don't walk out there with swords. They walk out there and they negotiate, and they're often quite successful in getting these barbarians to, stop completely pillaging and destroying the people and moving on to settlements. So where did the Visigoths settle after sacking Rome? Well, they move over to Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, and interestingly, the Visigoths. We talked about a Christian heresy this week known as Arianism, and the Goths remain largely Arian in their Christianity. So they kind of hold to a heretical form of Christianity for another couple hundred of years, until the 7th century, when they begin to convert to more Orthodox Christianity. So even though Arianism is condemned in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, right? We sing the Nicene Creed. Even though it's condemned, it still lasts, and like I mentioned, it still is around today with Jehovah's Witnesses. The Huns, led by their fierce leader Attila, who ruled for 20 years over this tribe, also invaded Roman territory. So he's not, content to just drive out the barbarian tribes. He also wants to come in and take on the big guy. What was the nickname that they gave to Attila? He was called the Scourge of God, because he was viewed as a judgment. And again, we saw how the Assyrians are explicitly, and the Babylonians are explicitly said to be God's agents of judgment. So that could be true. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe that established a kingdom in North Africa, raided and pillaged Rome. And they did something in particular that leaves their tribal name in our language today, right? The word vandalism comes from these guys because of how they mistreated property. With the onslaught of the barbarian invasions, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. Many historians give the date of 476 for the fall of Rome. Again, you have the sacking of Rome in 410, but essentially you have the collapse here at the end of the 5th century. So I'd like you to read this Historical Perspectives, where it talks a little bit about how we're supposed to think about the fall of Rome. So you can pause here to do that. List 3 economic problems troubling Rome in the late days of the empire. Again, we had a chance to discuss this toward the beginning. The problem of keeping the government funded, therefore an increased tax burden, devaluing the currency, which leads to inflation, and therefore everybody has lack of confidence. If you listen to the news, you'll often hear them talk about, there's an increase in consumer confidence, as people think that they're getting better jobs, that they're being able to afford more things. There's an increase in consumer confidence. Well, there was a very low consumer confidence at the end of the Roman Empire. Which emperor sought to solve the political problems of the empire by dividing it into 4 administrative divisions called prefectures? Again, this is the end of the 3rd century, and that would have been Diocletian. Which emperor divided the empire between his 2 sons, leading to the division of the Roman Empire into 2 separate empires? Now we're talking about the end of the 4th century, and that would have been Theodosius the First. Theodosius the First. And if I remember right, it was his son, Theodosius II, who outlawed all non-Christian religions, made Christianity the official religion of the empire. What did the Romans call the Germanic peoples who settled among the borders of the empire and threatened the security of the empire? Barbarians. In what year did the Western Roman Empire collapse when a non-Roman was placed on the imperial throne? That would have been AD 476. So again, there's such an integration taking place that one of the barbarians essentially has become the emperor. So it's no longer a pure Roman. All right, who were the Huns? These are vocabulary terms you need to know for your test. Nomadic tribe led by Attila, whose advance forced Germanic tribes to seek refuge in Roman territory. Who were the Visigoths and what battle? A Germanic tribe that settled in the Eastern Roman Empire defeated Rome at the Battle of Adrianople. What year was that? It's back in the 370s. The Vandals, Germanic tribe that established a kingdom in North Africa, plundered Rome after the Visigoths and left all kinds of vandalism. All right, I think that brings us to the end of this section.